All right, guys. So I'm picking back up where I left off on the last one from the translation retargeting settings. Now we're going to talk about the IK bones and virtual bones. So IK bones have been around in the engine for a while. They've been used for a long time. They predate virtual bones, which I believe were introduced into the engine back in 2021. So as you can see, they have not been in the engine for an insane amount of time. They're fairly new, but they work basically the same way as IK bones do. So it looks like I accidentally created a curve here. I'll just remove that. So how are IK bones used? So to start off with, I'll just go ahead and start by explaining how the foot bones are used. So I'm just going to move back over to Quen so that I can demonstrate this better. This animation right here, as I told you before, it was made for Quen, which is the retarget source asset. So whenever they made this animation, what they did is they actually constrained or pinned this bone to the foot. The IK foot R right here, which I have selected, was pinned to the foot R. So if I find the foot R and I select it, you'll see it's in the same position. Now this is in local space, so this is a global space, and in fact I can set this to something like, let's just make it really big. I'll just set it to 150. So you'll see that the actual x-axis of the foot R is pointing backwards. Now, if I select the IK foot R, you'll see it's also pointing backwards and it's in the same place. And as I scrub through this, you'll see that the foot orientation will change because the X is actually the down direction of the foot. And you'll see it maintains the same orientation. So, and that's because it was constrained or pinned to the foot during the animation when they baked it out. Its animation data placed it and oriented it the way that it is. One thing to note with IK bones is it's common for small offsets like this to come into play in here. And that's not because of the translation retargeting settings, so I just wanted to clarify that for you. That's just because of some errors that occurred when baking it out and migrating it. It tends to happen from time to time. A small error like that's not going to make a huge difference. But one thing to know is that using virtual bones can basically do the same thing. And the thing about virtual bones is that they will not be susceptible to those errors. They will be exactly where they're supposed to be. But like I said, small errors like that are not a big deal. Whenever you use IK, it's going to assume that this is where your foot is, not here. Not here. It's going to assume it's here, because what the foot IK systems normally do, and this is the foot IK for the third person template. If you go into the animation blueprint, you'll see a control rig here, which is referencing that foot IK control rig. And this is a simple example that I can show you related to that. You'll see that they have included the IK bones for that. And what they're doing is they're doing a trace down from where the foot is and up from where the foot is to figure out where the surface is. Is it above or below? And then they're getting that offset, the offset from the actual foot's location to where the surface is. And then they're interpolating that. They're interpolating this value towards that location. And they're choosing the lower value that's lower towards the ground as the pelvis's position. They're then modifying the location of the actual IK foot bone to be that interpolated Z offset. And they're only offsetting it up and down in component space. And if you see global space in here, global space is actually rig space. It's basically the same thing as component space. There is a little nuance to that, but it's very safe to assume that the spaces are equivalent, because you can't. I'll go into that in a later video, and when I do, you'll fully understand why I say that. But for now, let's just focus on this. So they're offsetting the IK bone only up and down. And as I told you before, these IK bones will follow the foot during like the runs and stuff, the jumps, whatever. And so they're just offsetting that foot bone down towards the ground. And then they're offsetting the pelvis as well. And then they're using full body IK to drive the foot towards that IK target. And that makes sure that the feet always look like they're planted firmly on the ground. Now this is a pretty basic one. It doesn't rotate the forward up and down to match the slope of the surface that they're on. But there are some that are far more complex than this and robust. But this is a good example just to try to drive that home to you. They're just offsetting that virtual bone up and down, and then they're driving the foot towards it. Now, as far as the IK handgun bone, the IK hand L, and the IK hand R, and let me actually just set this back down to 0. These are used for the IK hand R and IK hand L. Those are normally used for corrections. However, you do have this IK handgun bone right here. And the way that works is they normally have a control for positioning that, and they'll normally have that constrained to the hand, but then they can offset it from the hand using that control. So it'll follow the hand with an offset. So what they'll do is when they're making the animation, they'll actually attach the pistol to the IK handgun bone, and then they'll position that bone to where they need to be so that the hand looks like it's in place. But then the IK bones will be constrained to the actual location of the hand R and the hand L. And it's kind of hard to manually move that into position. But as you move that, it'll look something like that. All right. So, and as the hands move, it'll stay where the hands are. But this handgun bone will stay where it is. And that allows them to basically, for, a rocket launcher holding, or a pistol holding, or a rifle holding, they can have a reference for where the hands are relative to that gun, and then they can use IK to drive the arms or the hands towards those offsets from that gun so that they stay relative to the gun. But then they can also use IK to dynamically adjust the actual IK handgun's position relative to the body. So this is an older technique. I think better techniques that I've seen have it based off of the spine, or they'll actually just have it based off of the hands. So in ALS, they actually use virtual bones from the hand L pointing to the hand R. And virtual bones basically work the same way. So if I add a virtual bone on the hand L and it's pointing to the hand R, then it would be like having an IK bone, an unweighted bone, that's relative to the left hand, but it's constrained to the right hand. So if I deselect that and select that again, it'll highlight it, and it shows you that it's coming off the left hand, and it's at the position of the right hand. Now, the good thing about these bones is they'll always be exactly where they're supposed to be. This bone right here is offset because I manually offset all that. But if I just reset that, all of those locations to how they were, then you'll see that those are offset from the actual position due to errors. But the virtual bone is exactly where the other hand is, as you can see. And it, like I said, it works the same way. So just in case you weren't aware, virtual bones are treated just like regular bones, okay? So on the back end, and I've been informed of this by an actual guy that writes animation nodes for the NMGraph in C++. And from what he's told me, all of these bones in this list, they're just stored in an array, and virtual bones are in that array too. And Unreal Engine has no way of distinguishing what's a virtual bone and what's a real bone. So whenever it sees a virtual bone, it's going to treat it exactly like it would a real bone, just so that you know. So whenever these poses are being evaluated and ran through this, NMGraph, when it's going through these nodes, it's going to affect the virtual bone the same way it will any other bone. Something else to know, though, is that these virtual bones are not immune to differences in anatomy. So if I switch it back over to the SKM Mani Simple, it may appear in this pose that it's exactly where it's supposed to be, but if I come over here and I say a pistol, let's just say a pistol idle ADS, then the virtual bone will not be exactly where you would expect it to be. As you can see here, it maintained that offset, but it's not exactly where it was on the hand R. But if I switch it back to Quinn, you'll see it is. You see, that virtual bone is exactly where the hand R is for Quinn, and that's because, well, let's see if I can, okay, if we come over here to the preview settings, you'll see the animation it's currently in is right here. You can reset that or browse to it. I'm going to browse to it and open it up. And if I come over here to the asset details, you'll see the SKM Quinn Simple is actually the retarget source for this asset, for this animation asset. So this animation asset was made for Quinn, not for Mani. And because Mani has broader shoulders, when we switch the preview mesh over to Mani, you'll see that in this situation, his hand is offset to the right and back. And that's because he has broader shoulders, and he does have longer arms, but if you look at the way he's standing, he's rotated off to this direction. And that's the reason why this hand is back further rather than forward further. Something else you'll notice too is if we look at the feet are in further than the IK bones, because the IK bones are going to be exactly where they were for Quinn, because our translation retargeting settings are set to animation. And as I told you before, animation scaled doesn't really make a difference due to, the way that things work. But anyway, why are the feet in? Why does he have a narrower stance and Quinn has a wider stance? And that comes down to the difference in the pelvis. So as I told you before, Quinn has wider hips, so her legs are spaced further apart. Her shoulders are in closer. His are farther apart, but his hips pelvis is narrower, meaning his legs are closer together. So that's how everything ties together. You have these bones. As far as the IK hand L and IK hand R bone, those are mostly used for references. So what you do is you use IK to see where that virtual bone is, and you can place the hand R at where that virtual bone is. So in this situation, even though we have this issue right here, the hand is in the pistol is in the right hand. What we would actually do is say we would create a virtual bone pointing to the left hand. And so in this situation, what we would do is we would use IK to drive this left hand to where this virtual bone is right here. And now he might not even still hold it perfectly because his hands are bigger than Quinn's. So it might still not look perfect, but it'll look closer to perfect. The thing is, though, is that's not exactly why we have these bones, these virtual bones, or in this case, pointing from one end to the other, but also these IK bones as well, you see. So in this case, it's just totally offset, which is why in this situation, virtual bones would actually, off of one hand pointing to the other, that actually would work better in this situation. But I'll go over setting that stuff up and using that stuff in more in depth in a later video. The important thing to note, though, is that these are actually used as references for where the hands were in a lot of cases. So say, and I'm not going to go over additives right now, but later on we're going to go over additive animations. And additive animations will sometimes offset the arms relative to each other. So the arms might be clipping, the hands might be passing through each other, or or through the forearm over here, or they might be way spaced apart over here. But you know that before you applied the additive, you know that the hands were exactly where they needed to be. Or in that they weren't swimming around, right? Because you're applying a breathing animation, which makes the hands move up and down and left to right. And they're not going to be perfectly in sync. So you want to stabilize the hand so that it's not swimming around and it's holding the rifle firmly and where it's supposed to be holding it. Well, what you can do is you can apply an additive over the entire upper body, and then you can go back and say, okay, on that rifle holding pose before I applied this additive, where were those bones at? And then you can place those bones back where they were on that animation and use those virtual bones or IK bones as effector targets for the IK to drive the hands to, and that'll place the hands back where they were before you applied that additive. That way he's still holding the weapon properly. Okay, so that's how virtual bones and IK bones are used. That's just a brief introductory. It's a very complex topic, but I will go into further depth on that. I just wanted to try to get all this stuff out of the way this weekend, because I'm working towards actually getting us into animation. So the next video, or one of the next videos after this, I'll actually start talking about animation. I'll introduce you guys to blend spaces and layered blend per bones and state machines and all of that stuff.